Welcome to Comlink Satellite Service. You have selected Faster Than Light News Feed for Monday, 7 October, 2146.
Hello, I'm Sheila Vox, President and CEO of Comlink, and I have something important to say to all of you. Last week, Elena Koblatz accused Comlink of fostering and supporting an anti-Tau bias in its reporting. Nothing could be further from the truth. FTL Newsfeed provides up-to-the-minute coverage of every newsworthy event on world and off. Our anchors report the facts as they happen, without bias. Our commentators, however, air their opinions, and those opinions are clearly labeled as such. Miss Koblatz demanded we hire Tau apologists to, quote, balance AI's criticism of Taoism. I don't think so.
This has been an FTL News Feed.
Gentlemen, let's broaden our minds.
Are they in the proper approach pattern for today?
Negative.
Hold weapons! Now! Charge the lightning field.
Welcome back to Dispatch Ajax. This is our show. We do this show. I'm Skip.
Everyone's telling me that these days. I'm Jake. Yes, it is our show. We do this show.
But I think, therefore, I am Sebastian.
I pod, therefore it is.
Poignant, actually.
It's pretty deep if you dive in.
That's deep, bro. So, we are going to launch into a miniseries, the name of which has yet to be determined, but we're talking about the Sci-Fi Channel. Its origins,
Sci-Fi.
Yes, indeed, its intended purpose, and its impact on society at large, which is surprising, then also tragic in many ways. So we thought we'd go into what the Sci-Fi Channel was, what it became, and then what it is now. And then we were going to break down a series of shows that were on the Sci-Fi Channel and only on the Sci-Fi Channel, which was the only way you could watch them. Because until Tubi, there was never such a great resource for obscure television and movies than the Sci-Fi Channel. Outside of the USA Network and sometimes TNT, you never got to see Arena or Supercar, or even, quite frankly, outside of a lot of PBS stations, Doctor Who.
Doctor Who?
And the original series of Star Trek, because there was a dispute over who had the rights, NBC or CBS, because the original pilot was NBC, and then it failed, but then the second pilot was on CBS. That's a whole rigmarole. The Sci-Fi Channel. I was so excited when this came out. My parents were super excited. There was this really cool thing that they did when they were about to launch. And this is before streaming, obviously. This was the 90s. This was during the rise of cable networks, which we take for granted now. That whole era has died and moved into streaming, but this was around the time that, for instance, HBO, which just used an aggregator for movies that were never going to be shown on network TV, they created their first original content with stuff like The Larry Sanders Show. Science fiction, fantasy type shows and movies were traded around on VHS tapes. So, the Sci-Fi Channel was originally launched on September 24th, 1992. It was a cable network, and some of their first programming was Star Trek the Original Series and Star Trek the Animated Series. Star Trek creator, the great bird of the galaxy, Gene Roddenberry, and prolific sci-fi writer Isaac Asimov served on the initial advisory board for the creation of this network. Which is really interesting. First of all, that a network had an advisory board, and that they were some of the most prolific icons in the history of that genre.
Yeah. That board is created because of Mitchell Rubenstein and Laurie Silvers. They were a married couple, and in 1988, they were attorneys and entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they had been involved with cable carrier and they wanted to make a new channel. Now, Lori, she came up with the idea of something called the Hair and Makeup Channel, which she thought was going to be huge.
And would be today, if it doesn't already exist.
Yeah, I'm sure it's out there. But Mitchell had a different idea. He thought, what about a channel devoted just to science fiction? Lori was very nonplussed and non-convinced.
Mitchell.
So Mitchell took her to a local Blockbuster Video, and they went to a big section there, and it was science fiction and fantasy films. It's all over. Mitchell showed her the top 10 grossing films of all time. 7 or 8 of them were science fiction films.
It's the 80s, baby.
Or fantasy for Star Wars. And they talked to the manager of the Blockbuster, and he talked about how science fiction fans were rabid. And they would come in, rent a movie, they would bring it back promptly and rent it again. And they would just do that again and again.
What an amazing snapshot of a time that we're talking about, where instead of hiring McKinsey or some other consulting firm or whatever, they just went to a Blockbuster Video. There has never been a more, of that moment.
Yes. Yeah. This was a husband trying to convince his wife that this was a good idea. Because at that point in time, she wasn't really into science fiction much. But she saw the numbers that were out there, like the rentals, what the manager was talking about, how the business seemed to work, and how the genre was taken to by fans. So she went out and she hired Gallup to run a national poll. And everybody watching cable, the numbers were huge that they would be interested in a science fiction only channel. Whether it was old viewers, new viewers, old sci-fi, new sci-fi, whatever, the numbers bore out through the polling that it would be a hit and people wanted it. So they saw this as a huge opportunity. This is when they put together their board of advisors, with Isaac Asimov being the head of it. Through one of his collaborators, they were able to get a lunch with him, and they pitched their idea for a Sci-Fi Channel. And he thought it actually was a great idea, and he thought they should do it because he thought that putting science fiction programming on TV consistently would be a great way to capture young science fiction fans, because he thought at that point kids weren't reading that much anymore. And by having something on the TV, it would bleed in, and then they'd become bigger fans and they'd go out more broadly into the science fiction fantasy world. They didn't really know where to go at that point, but Asimov had a friend that had a bunch of Hollywood muscle, and he thought he could bring him on board. That friend was Gene Roddenberry. And it's by helping him get on board that they were then able to grease some of the gears and start getting some connections into Hollywood. Now, they faced pushback from science fiction creators at the time. Part of their little board that they wanted, a lot of them thought that the label of sci-fi was dumbing down science fiction and that it was a bad idea. They didn't like shortening sci-fi. They wanted to call it the SF channel. They thought that would be better. But
okay.
Lori and Mitch were worried that if it was the SF channel, people think it was a channel about San Francisco.
Right, yes. And especially if you ever watch Star Trek, where 90% of Earth-based stuff is centered out of San Francisco.
So they were like, nah, we're not sure. We think sci-fi is the right way to go. But their little board was nonplussed with it. But Asimov stood up and he explained himself that no, sci-fi, using this shortened term, would be good overall. And eventually all the other science fiction writers and creators got on board. What the Sci-Fi Channel does with their naming after that, you wonder if maybe they had a point.
No, I think they definitely had a point.
Yeah, they had thought about just naming it the Science Fiction Channel, but their polling also pointed to people who saw that it just said science fiction. Too many of them thought it would be a science channel, and they would not be as into that.
The genre in literature went through many iterations. One of the later most recognizable would have been scientific fiction, because it wasn't necessarily hard based in science. It was scientific-ish fiction.
Yeah, and folks, we like our science rock hard.
I am right now.
So they had an advisory board. They had an idea. They were trying to get some money and some connections together. What they really didn't have was a lineup. They were having some trouble with that, but they were able to score a deal to work with Disney and their theme park through a crazy, weird connection with their bank and their fellow attorney and trying to get deals. So they were going to have a studio space next to where the famed Disney illustrators worked. So essentially, at the same time that they were coming up with the idea for Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast, ideally they would be filming science fiction shows in a lot directly next to it. I think their original idea was like a untitled superhero show, what did they say? A game show set in a haunted house kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
And some other things. That's where they're going to be able to have original programming, working with MGM and Disney with this. That's where they're going to produce new shows. Now, eventually, they just didn't have the financial backing for real success for creating their own channel. They needed money for satellite transponders and licensing fees and different things. So this is when they went to a somewhat fledgling channel at the time, but one of the bigger up-and-comers in the world of media, the USA Network. And this was run by Kate Kopowitz, who started out with the MSG Sports Channel. She turned it into the USA Network. She was essentially a titan of the cable industry, but really never got her due. She was a key player in the integration of satellite-to-air sporting events. It's because of her they aired the Thrilla in Manila.
Ah, yes.
She turned what was a local regional sports channel into the USA Network, which at the time was like one of the biggest cable channels anywhere.
Which is very funny if you think about it today retroactively.
Now, the USA Network was co-owned by Paramount and MCA. Kate loved the idea, supposedly, of the Sci-Fi Channel when Laurie was pitching it, and after negotiating for a few weeks, said she needed to go back to her partners and discuss. The story that Laurie tells was that Kate came back to Laurie and said, hey, USA Network, Paramount, MCA, we're all in, but we don't want to give you money, we want to own it. Laurie obviously was like, I don't know. I've been working years of my life at this point on this project. I'm passionate about it. This is our idea. Kate told her that you can either sell it to us or we're just going to go make it on our own without you. This is a gold ticket idea and we don't need you to be part of it. You can either be with us or we're going to crush you.
Or with the terrorists. Yeah.
I love this, but obviously there's no way we could go up against these major studios, these multi-million-dollar corporations, one of the biggest cable companies in the world. It's just not going to happen. They did end up selling the Sci-Fi Channel to the USA Network. If you listen to Kopowitz's version, it's a little bit more nuanced and a struggle to get the green light from Paramount, MCA, and their higher-ups at USA. But in the end, now the USA Network had Sci-Fi Channel, and now Sci-Fi Channel had a whole vast library of IP to program with. Stuff they wouldn't have had before at the beginning. Stuff like Battlestar Galactica, Night Gallery, The Incredible Hulk, Buck Rogers, Kolchak the Night Stalker, Bionic Woman, the failed Planet of the Apes series, and Misfits of Science.
A lot of those were failed, by the way. Not just that one.
Yeah. But by doing this, the previous deal with MGM and Disney had to be scrapped. So the ideas that they had to film on the lot and work with them, they no longer worked. They were superseded by this USA Network purchase. They kept Laurie on for a few years as vice chairman to sell to cable operators, which she had the passion, being an entrepreneur, working at this for years. She did a great job of selling it to different cable operators and got it on lineups across the nation. At this point, it was time. They had the programming, they had the money, they had the wherewithal, they had the connections within the cable thing, and they were able to get a channel on the lineups.
They had the technology.
They launched, and you had the title card that lionized Isaac Asimov and Gene Roddenberry. Unfortunately, both had just passed months prior to the launch. And then you had the first episode of FTL.
Welcome to Conlink, FTL Newsfeed, 24 September 2142.
This is an FTL Newsfeed special report. Kai Densmore, curator of the Skywalker Floater Museum and Theme Park, announced today that the only known complete print of the 165-year-old science fiction masterpiece, Star Wars, has been located and fully restored. The film will soon be transferred to Holodisc so that legions of Star Wars fans can enjoy this timeless classic in the comfort of their own heads. But now, by special arrangement with Comlink, a sneak preview of the fully restored Star Wars will be presented in its entirety on the Sci-Fi Channel immediately following this report. For more news, including the latest on the identity chip controversy, be sure to watch the next regularly scheduled FTL newsfeed right after Star Wars.
I don't know if you ever heard of that.
Yes, that is the long and short of it. And in this series, we will get into more detail about this. But leading up to that, they did one of the greatest marketing campaigns in the history of television, where they did this thing where the channel existed on a satellite network. My grandparents had an actual fucking satellite in their backyard, a giant satellite dish, so they could do this. But you'd go...
Yeah, I don't think kids understand, like, what you needed back then. This wasn't DirecTV.
No.
This was a huge, what'd you say, like 20, 30-foot satellite?
Yes. The satellite dish my grandparents had was probably 20 foot across at least. And you had the tuner, what they called it, the remote that they used, literally was this brushed aluminum remote that had only two buttons, up or down. And what it would do was it would turn, based on your button inputs, the entire dish one way or another, which is crazy. That's some Cold War bullshit, but was the standard at the time. And so you had to literally move your satellite dish to connect to a different satellite that would be beaming this information to your dish and then into your box that would translate that information into their broadcast. And so it existed as a spot on, I don't want to say virtual, but like a list of stuff unnamed, where you'd have to be like, okay, if I want to watch HBO, I have to like tune it to this basically GPS coordinates to connect with the satellite. Okay, so you're doing that and you're going through and you're, for lack of a better term, scrolling through these satellite outputs. All of a sudden, one day, there was this channel that was just showing loops of video with no explanation, no commercial breaks, no station IDs, all that stuff that spawned out of the War of the Worlds radio play and all that stuff. It was just, you'd come across this channel that was showing essentially screensavers, these just loops of bright colors and simulated tunnels and wormholes, or sometimes it would show like planets as you go through the solar system with no explanation or context. It felt like pirate radio type stuff. And I'd go to my grandparents' house to tune into it every day to see if there was some sort of hint as to what it was. And it wasn't until the debut of the channel as a channel to identify itself, it put out this ominous promo, speaking of an invasion that was, quote, coming for you. And then it started a countdown clock that would tick down the hours, minutes, and seconds until the Sci-Fi Channel would make its debut. And I was obsessed with it. It's kind of like how, I don't know if you remember, but when the Cloverfield trailer premiered and everybody had all these like online obsessive theories about what it was and what it was going to be. And is it a Godzilla movie? Is it not? That's what the Sci-Fi Channel did. They did this for months leading up to the premiere of the thing. And I was like, are we getting aliens? Are aliens talking to us? I couldn't wait. And it worked. This countdown led to the premiere of the Sci-Fi Channel, hyphenated.
The original is hyphenated, yes.
Right.
And that will obviously change over the years.
Mm-hmm.
It will morph.
Mm-hmm.
It will evolve into its lesser form.
The first thing they show...
First, after the countdown, they do a title card that gives praise and thanks to Isaac Asimov and Gene Roddenberry, again, who had just passed away months before, unfortunately.
So sad.
Yeah, and then they'd have the first of what is a oddity for years to come on the Sci-Fi Channel of FTL news. Then the opening scroll of Star Wars. And this is pre a Star Wars A New Hope. It was just Star Wars.
This version of Star Wars does not exist anymore. What they showed was the theatrical release of the original Star Wars. You cannot find this anymore. This is it. This is Star Wars, where you can see the traveling mats of the TIE fighters as they fly by. Is there a better way to kick off a network?
During research for this, I saw multiple news station segments of the upcoming premiere of the Sci-Fi Channel. Although I think they called it the Science Fiction Channel at the time.
Yeah, because they don't know what the fuck's going on. It's like an Arrested Development where like they flash back and the Fox News anchors, do you want coffee with foam in it? Wait till you hear what it costs. And the first thing they do is their own fictional sub-show, an interstitial universe that they create that is supposed to tie everything together. And then, boom, the drop of the opening title sequence to Star Wars. It was so cool, especially if you were a sci-fi fan.
Yeah. One, it is science fiction fans, so they have a natural inclination to fanaticism and fandom and breaking things down and waiting for their favorite thing to drop. Two, this was a first. This was an oasis in a desert.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't see Star Wars on TV unless you went and rented it at the video store, or they happened to show it on one of the big four, I guess big three at that time,
yeah.
right?
And especially because Lucas was vehemently opposed to Star Wars ever being put out on home video. He thought it should just be a theater experience. Also, he didn't want it to get... That was back in the time when they thought VCRs and VHS was just pirating things. One of those cycles we go through over and over again. But
it's like a rhyme.
History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. It was a huge media moment. And yes, it feels like it's for a niche crowd, except they knew it was going to be a big deal. And we take the Sci-Fi Channel today for granted. And I know it's changed even in the last 10 years or 5 years. But when it came out, it was a big deal. There were only 3 real networks. Fox was a burgeoning network, but there were only 3 real networks: NBC, ABC, and CBS. Cable, you only had a few. You had HBO, the Playboy Channel, Penthouse, or whatever, and then Showtime, Cinemax, and then, I don't know. I don't even know that Comedy Central or the Comedy Channel was around back then. Maybe around the same time.
Technically, the Comedy Channel and Humor were around, which would later be merged into Comedy Central.
Comedy Central, that's true, yeah. Around the same time. This is the birth of the network system that we know today. And it was a huge premiere. And though it may seem niche, all of the research that they had done, there was always a thing at Paramount where they said, we'll always make Star Trek movies because Star Trek will never lose us money. There is always a built-in fan base. And not just that, it had a more broad appeal than people think there would be. And it premiered. It was a huge deal for a large swath of the American audience. This release would be, I think, not only a portent for things to come, it would help set the stage for how networks worked, how cable networks worked, and then eventually how streaming networks worked. There would be no HD TV. There would be no Discovery Network. All of these other genre-focused networks were it not for the Sci-Fi Channel. And it's funny because in its origins, it involved, like you said, Disney, Universal, Paramount, MSG, like USA. All of these other networks coming together to make this a realized thing. And I think today people sleep on it because of what it is now, but man, it was secretly a big deal. And that's what we're going to get into in this series. Forthwith, not just the fascinating origins and makeup of the Sci-Fi Channel itself, but then all the fun things that the Sci-Fi Channel does, what it helped us see that we would not have normally been able to, and how that leads to things like Tubi. Also, how it leads to things like the origin of YouTube, the original YouTube, before Google bought it. And
Yep, I think you already got it. This
okay, fine.
This is all the stuff you just...
Great, whatever.
Borg say stop.
Frankie say relax.
Borg said good, stop licking.
It's funny because that's exactly what Miles is doing right now.
Thanks for listening. Borg say come back.
Jake say relax. He's gonna...
No, yes, we're going to get into a little bit of the history of Sci-Fi Channel and some shows that spawned out of that and what that meant for long-term pop culture and television viewing, media consumption. But until then, we'd like to thank you all for spending some time with us. Please share, subscribe, rate us. We didn't talk about anything.
The final 5 stars? I don't know. Rate us 5 Cylons?
Borg say rate 5 Cylon. Borg likes Cylon.
Boy, they sure would.
Yeah, rate it the final 5 Cylons on the podcast app of your choice, ideally Apple Podcasts. It's the best way for it to get heard and thus seen. Spread the news on the FTL Newswork. Newswork? That's not a word. News Network.
Uh-huh.
Yes. Borg not bring 2 word together.
Borg smash.
Borg go bed now. But yes, I'll come back for that. But until Borg explain Sci-Fi Channel U, skip, say, end for Borg.
I look at the Borg like an unfrozen caveman.
Borg is unsure and scared by your fancy podcast lingo.
What tiny man lives inside the radio in my car? I jumped into traffic. Yes, we would encourage you, please, do everything that Jake just said, except jumping into traffic, which is what I said. But please follow our show, do those things, engage with us as Jean-Luc Picard would encourage you to do. Please make sure you have cleaned up after yourselves to some sort of reasonable degree. Make sure you've paid your tabs. Make sure you've tipped your bartenders, your KJs, your DJs, your podcasters. Don't forget to support your local comic shops and retailers. And remember, no matter where you go, there you are.
Borg agree.
Borg say yes.
Please, go away.